Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for a Learning and Growing webinar on supports for note-taking to increase student success. Our presenter today is Shauna Hudson of Iowa Wesleyan University. My name is Sidra, and I'll be your moderator for Hawks Learning. We will have a live Q&A session after the presentation, so please enter any questions you have into the Q&A module as we go, and we'll be sure to answer them at the end. I'll now hand it over to our presenter.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. So wonderful to be here today. And so I'm going to share my screen here and we're going to go ahead and get started. So we're going to be talking today about supports for note taking. And really, I see this as just making lecture material accessible for more students. A little bit about myself. My background is in the area of dyslexia, in the area of literacy and special education. I was a teacher and a principal before I became a college professor, and I work in the Department of Education here at Iowa Wesleyan. So one of the things that I've really been focusing on, both for students at the high school level and also at the college level, is really trying to make that lecture material, because we know in those settings in a lot of courses that we are going to spend time lecturing, but how do we make it accessible for more students? I don't know about you, but sometimes I have students who just sit there and don't take notes at all. I don't think that's a motivation issue. I think it's a I don't know how to issue, or it hasn't been successful for me in the past, like a student is saying this. And so they're really wanting ways to make that note taking or make that experience something better. If they're in your classroom, if they're coming, then I'm going to assume that they're wanting to learn. So we'll go ahead here and I'll tell you what our agenda is for today. So we'll discuss a little bit about why note-taking is difficult, because it is difficult. It's actually not an easy skill, but it's difficult, and it's more difficult for some students than others. We'll also consider 5 alternatives to note-taking. There may be more alternatives than these, but these are ones that I think most of us will be able to do. Some of them you could go back and implement even this afternoon, but hopefully you'll find one of the 5 something that you think is beneficial, or if you like to mix it up some, maybe you can try a couple of the 5 as well. And then we'll also share and participate in a question and answer session. At the end, I've allowed time for that. And so I do really want to hear your thoughts and maybe what you've used, and some questions you might have on some of these alternatives to note taking. So the first thing I want to do is talk a little bit about why it's such a struggle. Why is note taking, why is the lecture process, getting that information, difficult? And you may, as you're skimming this list here, you may notice that a lot of these are known as executive functioning deficits. And so we know that students with some disabilities, like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, dyslexia, and other unidentified disabilities, like maybe they haven't been formally identified, but there definitely is some barrier there to their learning. Oftentimes it'll be in the area of executive functioning that they might struggle. And so note-taking specifically is hard for lots of reasons. But if students have deficits in sustained attention, this note-taking process will be very hard for them. We all know that getting up, moving around, having a discussion, doing something takes less sustained attention than listening very intently to new material that is difficult for you while attempting to write, listen, catch what the professor or the teacher is saying, and then get that down. And if you have difficulty already with sustained attention, you really are not going to be successful in that situation. If students have deficits in metacognition, so metacognition is one of those executive functioning skills that means that we are aware of and thinking about the act that we're doing. And so if the professor is giving information, is writing on the board, is, illustrating and saying, now remember, we talked about this and here's this, the person in their head, they need to be thinking, okay, that's important. He just said this, that cues me that I should star it in my notes, or I think this might be like a main idea he's trying to get across. Oftentimes, students, we'll see this especially in the high school level, students may not be aware that when you're lecturing, that you're actually teaching them. And I know that seems crazy, but to some students, they don't get that that's supposed to be the learning for the day. They don't understand that that was the so-called input in the lesson plan. And so if students have deficits in metacognition, then the note-taking lecture process is very difficult for them because they aren't really tuned in, they aren't invested in that, and it's very difficult for them to get that information. The one that we probably see the most is deficits in working memory. Working memory is an executive functioning skill, and working memory deals with the idea, it's like the internal scratch pad. Like if you have a scratch pad and you write down some notes so you don't forget, well, internally, you can hold so much in your brain to then use it right in that moment. And some of us have a better working memory than others. And so students who struggle in the area of working memory, they can't hold as much and they can't hold it to then use it, really struggle in the note-taking process. The reason they struggle in the note-taking process is if it's projected somewhere or it's written somewhere, they have to look, write, look back because their brain isn't holding as much as the person next to them, find their place, and continue to do that all while you're talking. And they cannot focus on all of these. And if you put together, what if they have deficits in sustained attention and working memory, then you can see how they really are not grasping the information. So if you say, well, I lectured on this and I gave multiple examples and I asked for questions, they likely don't have any questions because they don't even know that you taught them something and it has made no sense to them, or only bits and pieces have made sense. Another struggle is students with processing speed. Now, don't ever mistake that processing speed and intelligence are the same. You can have very high intelligence, but have very slow processing speed. And processing speed, again, is an executive functioning deficit. Everyone has processing speed, but if you have slow processing speed, it's a deficit. And so when you are attempting to listen and take notes and you have slow processing speed, or even just a little below average processing speed, you're missing the vast majority of the main points that are being made, especially if the professor happens to be a very rapid speaker. I have a very rapid rate of speech, and so that can be even more difficult. Other issues that really aren't executive functioning deficits, but our other deficits include students who have issues with spelling. If you are saying words, you're writing some of the words, you're not writing all of them. Trying to process how to spell words in their notes can be a stumbling block. We know that students with dyslexia, we know dyslexia is a very common learning disability. The majority of students probably in college and high school right now would be undiagnosed with dyslexia. We're getting better at diagnosing dyslexia earlier. They will struggle with spelling. It's a lifelong struggle. And so trying to write and record and remember how to spell things takes away from some of that working memory, from some of that sustained attention, because they're focusing on the wrong thing. Issues with writing, for example, dysgraphia. Some students might have dysgraphia, other students just have issues with writing. It can be fine motor issues, it can be related to processing speed, and so that can make it very difficult as well. The unfortunate part is there is some research that talks about that writing notes is better than typing notes. And when I have students kind of argue with me about that, I'll send them a couple of links that I have just to look at that. There is some research that says writing it actually helps you. I don't not allow students to type if they want to do that, but I try to get them to see that some of these alternatives I'm going to suggest are much better than just typing their notes. Another issue on why students struggle, and I think we're all responsible for this, I know I'm going to raise my hand and say that I am, is that students haven't been taught explicitly how to take notes. And if you've taught them how to take notes, good for you. Have you then given them practice with feedback? Meaning that you teach them how to take notes. You then have them take notes, you take their notes and you write on their notes, you missed this key point, or, okay, you have this backwards. Those were two different things. Now, obviously you can't do that after every lecture, and that's not what I'm saying. But one of the reasons that lecturing and taking notes is a struggle is because they haven't been taught explicitly how to take notes and then provided practice with feedback. I know I'm guilty in my classes. I don't teach them how to take notes and provide practice with feedback. If I have some students who are struggling with these alternatives, because I put these alternatives in place and it's taken care of the vast majority of my students. If I have one or two, I might sit down and have a one-on-one on a couple of ways to take notes. There are lots of different ways to take notes. I prefer and think there's research behind Cornell notes. If I'm going to teach someone how to take notes, that's a pretty good one, as long as they'll actually then do, Cornell notes, have the main idea is the information and then the summary at the bottom, as long as they do that summary, because that takes care of that, like, what did I learn today? And what do I get from these notes? Which is a really important part. So those are some reasons that students struggle with note taking. Notice I didn't mention obvious other ones like vision issues or hearing issues. I'm talking more about hidden disabilities, that something is a struggle for the student, but you might not be able to identify, or they might not be able to identify exactly what it is. So let's talk about 5 changes you can do, or alternatives to traditional note taking. Now, when I say traditional note taking, I'm assuming that means the type of note taking where the student is either copying what you have on the projector or on the board, something along those lines is what I'm assuming. Maybe you've given them a PowerPoint and they print out the PowerPoint and it just simply matches what's on the screen. Those are the kind of traditional means that I'm talking about. And so now we'll talk about 5 alternatives. So the first one I'm going to start with is my favorite. These aren't necessarily in order, but number 1, I think you get the biggest bang for the buck, and it's using guided notes. I've heard those called so many different things as I've worked with teachers at the high school level and other professors. I've heard them called slot notes. I've heard them called fill in the blank notes. I'm sure I've heard them called some other things. Maybe you can share some other things. But I think the most traditional name, and what you'll find if you do a Google search and try to kind of look into it a little bit, is guided notes. The other names aren't wrong. I'm just saying I think this is the most common name. So change number 1, use guided notes. So what I'd like to do is show you what guided notes looks like, and then show you a guided notes maker tool that's free that you can use. I've used it, and I can explain a little bit for you. So let's talk about guided notes. So this is what guided notes looks like. What I did was I was talking about the science of reading, and I had a definition for the science of reading. I took this from my own document where I have my notes for lecturing, like I talk from as I'm lecturing, and I simply copied and pasted it into the tool that I'm going to show you. And then I picked the blanks that I wanted to remove. And so you can see here in this paragraph, I have 6 blanks. The tool allows you to number them, letter them, or maybe even leave the first letter in, I think, if you want like a prompt, I think is what the tool will allow you to do. Of course, the notes that the blanks that you remove should be important words, should be words that later can be used as a study guide, should be like answers on the exam, key terms, things along that line. And so the students then obviously would have much larger than this for a typical lecture. I'm just showing you a part, but this is what they would pick up as they walk into the classroom. And so then as you're lecturing, you would go through and your notes would look something like this on the board, on the PowerPoint, on the projector, and they would fill in then with these words. So instead of writing all of this or trying to summarize on their own and figure out, okay, what was the main ideas, they're getting everything pretty much you're saying, plus highlighted or written in for them, they're writing it, are the main ideas. You can also on the tool maker do something like this, where on the way out the door, you can give them the answers to ensure they got the answers. Now, I look at note taking as if I'm using this as a teaching method, that I want them to access this information, that it isn't how good are you at taking notes, that's what your grade's going to be. Instead, it's I'm teaching you this information and I want to make sure you have the right information. And so that's why on the way out the door, then I let my students have the answers to the guided notes in case they missed it, in case they had issues with sustained attention and spaced off. I still want them to be able to have the correct information. So there is this guided notes maker tool, and I'm going to click on it here, and it looks like this. It is free. It is at interventioncentral.org, which is just a nice website with a lot of teacher type materials, but this is called the guided notes maker. And so what you do, it's extremely simple, is you just put your data in, you can put your title, you can leave this blank if you want. You can either type in here, or what I do is I just go to a Google Doc and I copy and paste and I just drop it in here, whatever I want. Now, a word of caution, occasionally it's glitchy, like not real often, but occasionally I'll click it. And then when I decide, like down here, do I want the teacher's list, the student's list? Do I want number tags? Those are the numbers, or letter tags and so on. How do I want it sent? I always do PDF, but you don't have to. Occasionally it's, and not very often, but it's a little glitchy. And I've just discovered I just get out of it and come back in. I mean, it's free and it works really well. So, you know, there might be glitches occasionally, but I just get out of it and come back in. So I don't tend to make this like everything I'm going to lecture this day. I tend to make it, you know, just some of the information, and then maybe do 2 or 3 PDFs versus one. But you can try it. Maybe it'll work perfectly fine for you. So that's one of the 5 alternatives. Use guided notes. The students are still taking notes, they're still paying attention, but it's reducing some of that cognitive load for those who are struggling in some of those different areas. The second idea, I really like this one too. It's called Grasp the Power of Annotation. And so this is a different than guided notes. I use both of these in my class depending on the information and what seems to fit best. And so I want to look then at some examples of how I do the annotation. So we'll scroll down here. Okay, so this is just an example here. What I do when I want to use annotation is I first give the students something like this, which explains what annotation is. And I really like this one right here. It's free on the internet. There are many others that you can find and use, or you can make your own, or you can have students make their own. But first I teach them, it literally takes maybe 10 minutes how to annotate. And so I will give them an example. It usually works best for diagrams like this over here on the left, and I'll explain that in a second. Typically works best for diagrams. It can, though, like work with the guided notes I just did, like circling important words, marking ideas. It works really well if you give them a short reading and then you're lecturing on the reading. And so basically you can see here what they're doing. It just causes them to really look and process, you know, that deficits in metacognition, not thinking about what you're doing. It helps them to think about what they're doing. Right? They're marking ideas, they're circling important words. So how I like to grasp the power of annotation is I like to give the students the actual diagrams or the lecture notes or the pages that we're going to be discussing. And then I say, while we're talking about this, you are to be annotating today. And so then they have all of the information in front of them. They're not worried about writing down really key words and so on. Instead, they're, as I explain, you know, now this path here is important because then, you know, it leads to this trench, and they circle this word trench, and you can see they're making notes off to the side. So they're really interacting with the material, and they're taking your knowledge and putting it on the paper in a way that they understand. And so I really like grasping the power of annotation. What I will do, though, is if I have students do it the very first time we practice. Maybe the second time I say, give me a page of your notes on the way out the door. Of course, sometimes I don't want to rip the page out and so on, you know how all of that goes. So I say, give me your notebook. And I will just look and see how their annotations are, because occasionally I'll have students who really aren't grasping the idea that they're supposed to like actually list things. They're supposed to be putting question marks and arrows. They don't grasp that. And so I might have to sit down with them individually and say, okay, this is to help you better think and interact with this material. So sometimes I have to do that occasionally. So that's the second of 5 alternatives. The next alternative is try a simple note-taking routine. This can have a huge impact. I do this in my class probably at least twice a week. I think you really could do it every day even. It would be probably better than just everyday lecture. If you currently lecture just traditionally right now every day, I think this note-taking routine can really help. This does not have to be the routine that you use. This is the routine I use. Your routine could look different than this, but I think the ideas I have in here are important ideas to help students access the material. So this is this is typically what I do. So I'll start the class if it's a lecture day, and about 3 to 5 minutes, we'll work on building background and review. And so that might include, I'll say, who can tell me something we learned yesterday? Who can tell me the topic we're on? Who can tell me the module we're in? Who can tell me how these 2 terms from the last 2 days are related? Who can give me something they learned that they didn't know prior to walking in today? Who can tell me something that they knew and can connect to another class? And so we just have a lively conversation. Sometimes I'll say, okay, here are 10 words on the board. I'm going to give you a minute. I want you to look at them, think if you know them, and then I'm going to ask people to quickly explain each word. So it's just real low key, but we're just getting that brain plugged back in. The students who have trouble with metacognition, it's getting them to think about it. The students who have trouble with working memory or any kind of memory, they're trying to pull back and retrieve some of the information so that everyone is starting from a place of some knowledge from what we learned previously. So I do that no more than 5 minutes. Then the second step is about 10 minutes. My students take notes. I lecture, preferably with guided notes, preferably, but this routine could be just your traditional, not giving any kind of alternatives. But then we stop. And I set the timer for 5 minutes and they turn and talk. And so sometimes it's like in a group of 4, sometimes it's in a group with your elbow partner. Sometimes if I have a reason, I might number them off quickly, depends on how big the class is. But even in a huge lecture hall, you can use the turn and talk and don't leave anybody out, right? So sometimes there'll be groups of 3, sometimes there'll be groups of 4 or 2. And they're talking about what were the key ideas and the need to know information that we just wrote in these 10 minutes. And so they have their notes and they're sharing with each other. Well, I think this is a key idea. Did you not hear? She said that was going to be on the test, or she said that's related to that information back there. Did you get that? Did you catch that? What do we think we need to know? Occasionally, I'll stop after the 5 minutes and I'll add in another 2 or 3 minutes where I'll say, I want to tell you the ideas that we need to know just now. And I'll go over what they should have been saying. It's a way for them to check. This is so crucial. This turn and talk, this need to know is so crucial for those who have slow processing. Remember, that's not at all equivalent with low IQ. Slow processing means their brain just doesn't process at the same speed as others. And so they've missed information, guaranteed. Or those that have metacognition issues. They just don't get that they're supposed to be learning something in that process, and they need to hone in, and this helps them hone in on that was the information. Oh, I get it. I did just learn something. Okay. And then we repeat. So then I go steps 2 and 3. I do about another 10 minutes of taking notes, and then another 5 minutes of turn and talk, and then another 10 minutes of taking notes, and another 5 minutes of turn and talk. And I don't see it as losing 15 minutes. Like if you do this 5 minutes times 3 here, I don't see it as losing 15 minutes. What I gain are students who have deeper understanding, less confusion, and deeper knowledge. And so that's it's been really beneficial. This is just an example of a routine. This would not have to be your routine, but it's the idea that there are certain things built in: building background knowledge, the turn and talk, the identifying the key ideas that were important in the information that was just learned. So another alternative, so the fourth alternative is provide a peer note taker. I'm sure you've all done this. I'm sure your colleges, if you're at a college or your high school, may require it for students with disabilities. It can be a good alternative. I have a couple of ways to change this, perhaps, that you might consider. Perhaps when we're providing a note taker, how about if you have 3 or 4 students, depending on how big your class is, 2 or 3 students, volunteer to be the note taker for the day. So you have 2 or 3 students. At the end of the day, they copy their notes or you copy their notes. And then if it works that day, if not the next day, those notes are available for anyone to pick up, not just the student with the disability. And so then students get to see other students' notes. There may be things they didn't catch. They can compare their notes, or if they're just flat out not able to take notes and not doing well, they have someone else's notes. Again, I don't see that as cheating. I don't see that as inappropriate, because if this is the method I'm using to help students access the material, I'm teaching through this way, I want them to have it. And if they weren't able to get it, then I want to provide them a way to get the information. And so you'll be surprised if you do that, the students who will pick up the notes. Your top students will always pick up the notes from the peer. And if there are 3 options, they'll pick up all 3 of the notes. And so that's just something that I think speaks volumes about students, just being unsure about their note-taking abilities and also wanting to have as many resources as possible. I've never had trouble with students volunteering to take notes, but if it is an issue, you could even consider some extra credit. I don't know if you have students who say, I need extra credit. You could, assuming they don't have deficits themselves, ask if they'd like to be a peer note taker for some extra credit or something along those lines. What I would not do is assign peer note takers. It's you 3 on Monday, you guys are Tuesday, you're Wednesday, because if you have a student who has issues with spelling and writing, that will, number one, they won't get anything from the lecturer because they'll be so worried. And number 2, it can be very embarrassing to have people look at your spelling and your writing and so on. So I would always have it be volunteer basis for the peer note taker. All right, and the last one is try the LiveScribe pen. I am not a consultant for LiveScribe. I am not saying LiveScribe is the only one, but I do have quite a bit of experience with LiveScribe pens. Their latest that just came out in February of this year, I have, and it is amazing, the updates that they've made. But if you're not familiar what a LiveScribe pen is, I want to show you a quick video of the LiveScribe pen, and then I'll explain how I've seen it used in both high school and in college.
The LiveScribe 3 Smart Pen turns your words into action. Your handwritten notes instantly appear on your tablet or smartphone. Once on your device, it's easy to convert your handwriting into text and send it to your friends or colleagues. Your tablet or smartphone can record audio as you write to capture the things you don't.
Hi, this is Mr. Green. I'm calling to confirm my reservation on April 18th.
Certainly, I have you down for 2 people at 7:30 p.m.
And your address is 252 California Street in San Francisco, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Excellent. We're looking forward to it. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Your notes become more useful when they appear in your favorite apps. Simply tap your notes to play back audio from that moment in time.
252 California Street in San Francisco, correct?
With the LiveScribe 3 Smart Pen, turn your words into action.
All right, so that gives you a little bit of idea about the LiveScribe pen. I actually like the Echo 2 the best. There are different ones, but this is how I see it used in high school. When I work with high school students who have dyslexia, Often the LiveScribe pen is the piece of assistive technology that we will use. It's very accessible because it's about $135 is the cost of the pen, and the notebooks for 4 notebooks, because you do need special notebooks, is about $29.99 for the notebook paper. And this is what we do. We have the student get permission from the teacher, and then we practice some with the student to make sure they know how to record, how to mute it, because it does make some noises if you don't have it muted, and that can be embarrassing, especially for high school students. And then the student takes notes or just makes symbols on their paper, like a star means play this part back because the teacher's talking about what's going to be on the test. Whatever the student is able to do. Most students will want to take notes just like they always have, and then just use the record function, which is just quickly tapping at the bottom to record at the parts where they're kind of struggling or getting lost. And then later they can go back and hit in their notes that very specific part, and it will play from the pen. The Echo 2 plays from the pen itself what the teacher said. And so I've seen students who have really been struggling, and we teach them how to use it. They get permission and they start using the pen, and it's amazing. And so they have a unit, let's say on the solar system. And so they're going all the way through the solar system. They have all of these notes, some are good, some aren't. And then they can't remember about the orbit of the planets. They go back 4, 5, 6, a week, a year back, and they click on that page in the notebook, and it will play at that exact place the information that the professor or the teacher was saying. And so it's very inconspicuous. It just looks like a slightly larger pen, but honestly, I have this pen right here, which is my favorite pen that I use, and it is no bigger than this pen. So unless the student draws attention to it, you would not know that the student was using a LiveScribe pen. This can be a wonderful resource. There are also ways for the professor to use a LiveScribe pen when they are taking notes and turn it into something called a pen cast. And you can look that up on YouTube. LiveScribe is not the only brand, but it is the brand that I use and I've had the most success with. It doesn't mean that others wouldn't be just as good. So those are the 5 alternatives that I wanted to present today. And now I'd just love to have your questions or your thoughts on these supports for note taking. So I'm gonna go back to our table of contents so we can see all 5, and then I'll see what questions that you have.
So we have one question so far. How do you share the peer note taker's notes for a Zoom class?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm guessing, I actually have not done that. So that's a really good question. If I were teaching a Zoom class and I wanted to use the peer note taker option, I guess, and maybe someone has a better idea, I would have them, if I was okay not looking at the peers notes first, I would probably have them do it on a Google Doc, and then do the share on the Google Doc and drop it in the chat on Zoom, and people could access that link. I don't always look at the peer taker's notes. Maybe the first or second time I will, but not always. So I think that would be an option, and maybe somebody has a different suggestion as well.
Thank you. And probably give everyone another minute or so to compile any other questions that they have.
And I did see it looked like there were maybe 2 things in the chat. Is that something I need to check, or can you check that?
All is good in the chat.
Okay.
All right, I don't see any other questions. Do you have any closing remarks that you would like to make?
I just want to say that I think looking at alternatives to note taking is just super important for students for the reasons that we've discussed. And so I just encourage people to look at the guided notes, the note maker tool, considering a peer note taker, the LiveScribe pen, annotation, and just to reach out if they have any questions.
Awesome, thank you. Thank you, Shauna, and thank you all for attending today. If you or any of your fellow instructors are interested in presenting for our Learning and Growing webinar series, please submit your proposals to the Learning and Growing website, which I'm going to go ahead and link in the chat now for easy access. We will be emailing you a link to view the recording of this webinar once it's available, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Thank you.